Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, I had a pretty neat time this weekend. I went to Mocha Fest, this comics and cartooning festival in Manhattan on Sunday. I was there to moderate a conversation with Noah Van Sciver, a past guest of the show. You're going to hear that next week, provided the audio came out as well as I sampled it. But I also got to walk the exhibit hall for an hour or so, catching up with friends, meeting listeners of the show who I only knew by email or social media, as well as pitching some interesting new guests. And, of course, I also came away with a nice stack of comics. It was great to see so many people at Mocha. I'll just put it that way. Also, I brought a big stack of podcast postcards with me to the panel with Noah and put those out on the table. And by the time I was done putting away my gear when we finished the session, they were almost all gone. So there may be some new listeners coming out of this. If you're one of the Mocha newbies, then welcome to the show. But I just enjoyed getting to gab with old pals. Like, walking in before the show opened, Summer Pierre and Glynis Fawkes were walking down the aisle, and it was just this getting to see people again and getting to talk and just finding out how people are doing. And in this case, later in the day, discovering that a two-time guest of the show, Daryl Cunningham, is taller than I am. That was one of those we'd only recorded remotely. I've seen him post pictures on Instagram. For some reason, I thought he was a shorter person, and I looked over him like, that's Daryl Cunningham, but he's much taller than I thought, which people have been saying about me during this whole Zoom era, too. So anyway, what I want to get across is that I felt happy while I was there, just reconnecting and getting to talk and getting to listen to people and getting to discover what they're up to in a different way than seeing posts on Twitter or Instagram or something. And in a weird way, it was a nice compliment to the 4-day Pharma Fest in New York City the previous week, where I did a lot of this, but on a professional level. And I guess that sense that both my professional and personal selves are getting back in touch with the world, that's meaningful to me. Now I'm just hoping I don't wind up testing positive for COVID, because I'm flying out this weekend to visit my family for the first time in 6 years. So that would not be a good move if I wind up doing that. So I am going to test and make sure and maybe not say anything. You'll find out next week. That's the important thing. I do have a show recorded in advance. We should be back next week, and you'll find out how seeing the family went. But let's get to this week's show. Now, my guest this time is Stevan M. Weine, M.D. He is author of the amazing new book, Best Minds, How Allen Ginsberg Made Revolutionary Poetry from Madness, from Fordham University Press. Best Minds explores Allen Ginsberg's poetry and life by focusing on his experiences with mental illness, and most importantly, his mother Naomi's schizophrenia, and how this all shaped his life and his art. And Stevan, he does an incredible job of exploring the pathology of Naomi's mental health and digging up records of what she actually went through and what Allen went through helping her or trying to help her. And then, well, it gets really complicated, as we'll talk about during the episode. But Stevan also performs deep readings of Ginsberg's poems as Ginsberg's medical records also, and really sort of explores the stages of his life as he became a poet, and draws all those threads and more together to create what I think is an important literary biography. So Best Minds, it's really an illuminating piece of work. As a reader, I learned an awful lot about how terrible the treatments for mental health were, even when well-intentioned, how things have changed over the decades, and what some of the treatments, especially lobotomization, which Ginsberg's mother underwent with Ginsberg's consent when he was a 21 or 22-year-old, and what other treatments did, not just to the patients, but to their families. And it's also what Stevan really gets across is the impact that Ginsberg's poems, especially Howl and Kaddish, but also other ones, had on how the public came to understand mental health and the conditions that patients and their families are living under, what madness really meant. And it has so much more than that in it. Stevan shows a deep love and appreciation for the poems. And his experience meeting Ginsberg and researching with him in the mid-'80s, when he was just starting out after med school and deciding to go into psychiatry, all that has stuck with Stevan and in some ways motivated him for the rest of his career. And it makes Best Minds personal, but in the best way. Stevan does, quote unquote, show up in some of the chapters in terms of, him sitting down with Ginsberg in those mid-'80s days and some of what went through his head while he was uncovering some of the records about Naomi and Ginsberg's commitments or their times in mental hospitals. But what matters is really how deeply he feels for this whole subject. Because the nature of trauma, what Naomi went through and what she put Alan through, and its reconciliation, in this case, into world-transforming art, really matters to him. The Best Minds, it's deeply researched. It's a well-told story with some really frightening revelations about Alan and Naomi's lives. And Stevan shows us how far the human mind can go, both into madness and into art, and what a fine line lies between those two worlds. On top of that, he actually has some prescriptive advice for the field of psychiatry, for what laymen can do, and also wrestles with some of Ginsberg's more controversial positions, which we'll get to in the course of the conversation. So I just want to say I was floored by Best Minds. I hope you give it a read. And I just realized I've actually got a podcast about a poet to kick off National Poetry Month, which I want to assure you was not planned by any means. But Best Minds, How Allen Ginsberg Made Revolutionary Poetry from Madness. It is a remarkable book, so go give it a read. Now here's Stevan's bio. Dr. Stevan M. Weine is professor of psychiatry at the University of Illinois at Chicago College of Medicine, where he is also director of global medicine and director for the Center for Global Health. He is the author of 2 previous books, When History is a Nightmare, Lives and Memories of Ethnic Cleansing in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Testimony in Catastrophe, narrating the traumas of political violence. His new book is Best Minds. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Stevan Weine. Tell me where Best Minds began for you. You can talk about your work with Allen Ginsberg, but also what prompted this book itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for asking. I guess it goes back to my interest in poetry and my interest in understanding suffering and trauma. I think I've been on my own journey to try to understand the place where those things intersect. And when I found Allen Ginsberg's poetry, I think in junior high school, it really spoke to me. And then a few years later, well, maybe more than a few. I find myself in medical school in New York City at Columbia, and I realized that Allen Ginsberg was a psychiatric inpatient there for 8 months when he was 22 years old. And I started reading about that, and I wanted to find out more about what his experience was then, and how did psychiatry look at it, and how does poetry look at it, and how do we reconcile those things with one another. And I couldn't find much, so I wrote him a letter. I sent it to his publisher. A few days later, I come home and there's a message on my answering machine from Allen Ginsberg. Wow, that was back in the day we had answering machines, and
Right.
and he just is like, "Hi, Steve. Yeah, I was a PI. That's what it's called, New York State Psychiatric Institute." And he said a few words about that. He said, "Call me tomorrow and we could talk." And so I did. And the first thing he said was, "Are you writing a book about me?" And I said, yes. And that was the right answer. So that's kind of when it began. I'm at the time, I think 23 or 24 years old and a medical student. And, talking with Allen Ginsberg, who's master poet and king of the counterculture. And I knew this was fantastic. And I also knew that it was going to take me some time to be in the right position to complete this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what brought you back to it in terms of finally making the book now in your, 40 years, almost 40 years after meeting Allen?
Well, in a way, I've never left it. I've been tinkering with it over the years. I've probably written several versions of it. But I did it as a labor of love, and I was just waiting till I felt like I had gotten it right. And you know how it goes. The pandemic gave me
a lot of writers told me they got a lot done in that first year or two that
exactly.
they didn't think they were going to get to. Yeah.
My other work, I do global mental health, and I travel all over the world. And so I was more or less grounded for a period of time. And I thought, this is the moment where I'm going to really do a deep dive and finish this. But honestly, it also took me a lot of years to properly integrate the different kinds of perspectives that I really needed to adequately understand Allen's poetry and life and how those interacted with one another. So, this.
And I would say the history, I guess, of psychiatry plays out in the course of the pages. What treatments were like, how they evolved, and for you approaching it just as you're considering a career in that space, and then decades later, finishing the project like this, that seems to be coded underneath it. In addition to Allen's story, in a sense, your story of psychiatry plays through it. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's true. It's like a leap into time of American psychiatry, looking at what was going on in the 1940s when, it was the era of massive institutionalization, like Pilgrim State Hospital with 13,000 patients, the era of lobotomy and other great and desperate cures before the era of antipsychotic medications. And so, a guy like Allen also has an 8-month hospital stay, which today would be completely improbable. But, I felt like psychiatry has evolved a lot over all of those years. There's still a distance between the way that psychiatry looks at experience and the way that art or poetry looks at experience, of course. But it's different. It's a different kind of space than it was then. And in many ways, I think that Allen Ginsberg and his system of belief has had an impact on psychiatry, and is part of what's led to changes. So, for one example, is now there's a lot of enthusiasm for psychedelic drugs as a part of treatment, as a part of treating PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other things. This is something that Alan pushed many, many years ago, and people were outraged by. And now it's pretty much mainstream.
Yeah, it really struck me the way you sort of show the impact he had on our understanding of mental illness first, and then, you know, how some of the treatments evolved and some of the things he proposed. Even beyond that the psychedelic aspect, the thing that I think you mentioned, that global health, that idea that the society at large can have a significant impact on people's mental health. A lot of these things have been sort of, back of my head, as opposed to, oh yeah, somebody actually concretized this and has been treating of this for years and years. So, less of a question than a random comment, but
no, that's yeah. But a good observation. I think that there's so many important things for psychiatry and all mental health professionals and people concerned about mental health in Alan's poems and teachings. And one of them is the idea of social diagnosis, which wasn't his term, but he, I think, really drew that picture in his great masterpiece, Kaddish, where he's telling the story of his mother's mental illness and odyssey through the mental health system. And, he doesn't just tell a story of an individual. He's really telling the story of an era, of a society kind of gone mad. This is a time of massive immigration. It's the post-World War II, well, pre and post-World War II, the time of nuclear bomb, a time when there's so much fear and chaos in society. It seems like everything's going up in flames, and this impacts the lives of everyone in society. And so I think he really saw Naomi's saga and those of many other persons who experience madness as, like completely connected with what's going on in society, and shouldn't be just individualized or pathologized. And I mean, this is coming from the mind and experience of a young man who was raised by his mother with serious mental illness. He was the caregiver. He writes this poem, Kaddish, which, as far as I know, is one of the first, let's call it, family member first person testimonies of serious mental illness. In those days, you really didn't talk about it. And here he's not only talking about it and exposing all of this stuff that Naomi, all the family went through, but he's bringing to it really, really remarkable poetry and also a lens of analysis that I think ultimately really impacted how we see those things. He humanized persons with serious mental illness like Naomi, or as he says in Kaddish, the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. We pay more attention. We're more empathic to starving people who are starving, hysterical, naked, because of Alan and because of the story he told in Kaddish of his mother. And that had a big influence on people like R.D. Laing, who is the famous anti-psychiatry psychiatrist, who wrote many books and had a big influence on our field. And I think also led to what we now call the emphasis on persons with lived experience, or another word we use is like peer support. So the idea that the persons who are experiencing serious mental illness really are in a unique and privileged state to understand it and to also support others going through it. I think that originates in many ways with Alan.
Do you ever think about the psychiatrist you would have become without that experience with him?
I know
it's a weird control group sort of question, but
I was very lucky to have him as in my life and to be a mentor. And I say in the book, I recall the time on a stoop on his street one summer evening when he turns to me and he says, "I want to make you into my kind of psychiatrist." Yeah. And I laughed when he said that. And I'm like, sure, okay. What do you mean? And how are we going to do it? But he was serious. He was offering himself as a mentor. And the thing is, he was not disparaging about psychiatry. He was not anti-psychiatry. He was in favor of it. He had contacts with many psychiatrists over the years, meaning like professionally, to teach them, to exchange information with them. And so, he just thought they needed to be more open. And so I think he saw an opportunity in me to shape a young mind, and I'm grateful for it. We had good conversations about things he had me read, like William James, for example, Varieties of Religious Experience, or we talked about cases I was working with at the time as a medical student or a resident, and I think it helped me, and so I was open to it, and I think he could sense I was open to it probably from the very first letter that I sent him, and it felt like a collaboration of sorts, which I was grateful for.
And what was the most difficult part of the book for you as you finally buckled down to make what we now as Best Minds?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure if this answers your question or not, but I want to say the first most difficult part of the process of research and was talking with Alan, really, because I felt very intimidated and starstruck by him. And I mean, can you imagine? He's, in his early 60s at the time. He's, again, a senior master poet, and here I am, a young guy, having to bring up things that are very uncomfortable. And he was in a lot of pain, on these issues. It was obvious to me and to those around him that, he still felt very guilty about things with his mother. He hadn't, let's just say, properly mourned them. I don't know. I don't even know what that would look like, but I mean, to be honest with you, but it was a very complicated experience to lose her to mental illness, to lose her to hospitalizations, to lose her to lobotomy, to lose her to death, and so on and so forth. So, I found myself in the position of him inviting me to talk with him about those issues. But I guess I feared at the time, like it would be too painful for him and he would just ask me to go away, at some point. He didn't do that, which was remarkable. So that, I think that was difficult, and I remembered a lot of that when I was writing the book. I guess so I didn't include a lot of that in the book, because the book is about Alan and not about me. And so one of the editorial decisions of the book was to, cut out everything that doesn't shine a light on Alan. So there are parts of my interactions with him that I include in there because I feel it's saying something important about him, not because it's saying something about me. So that was one of the challenging issues. I think it's also challenging to find ways to integrate different perspectives. So the perspective of art, the perspective of psychiatry on such a thing as his visions. One of the central experiences in Alan's life was his visions in 1948, where he made contact with William Blake, and something that could be dismissed by a psychiatrist as a hallucination or a symptom of an illness, but from his point of view, he had made contact with another dimension. He had connected himself with his literary ancestor, and this was an encounter of unbelievable meaning for him that he wanted to go deeper and deeper into. As he went deeper into it, he became more confused and not understandable to himself or to those around him. So it came to look like a kind of madness. So, how do you understand such things, and how do you allow space for both lenses of science, psychiatry, and art, poetry? And I think that striking the right balance there was a big challenge. There are other challenges too. I'll just name them, and then you could tell me. You could
Sure.
ask me if you want to go into them more. One of the challenges was where to end the book, how far in time to go, and I chose to end it, I think, around 1965. But I somehow sneak some things in there from the 1980s and 1990s. So that,
and even some Summer of Love 67 stuff, but yeah, yes. 65 is sort of the terminal point. Yes.
Yeah. And I wanted to, my focus was really on how he made revolutionary poetry, which really ends up being a big focus on Howell and Kaddish, which is 1955 and 1961, I believe. But then I was also interested in what he did afterwards and how he transformed many of the kind of principles and values, approaches that he learned from his poetry into activism, social advocacy, trying to lead the psychedelic movement with Timothy Leary, becoming a great world traveler and going to India and other such places, advocating for civil rights and civil liberties. These all are extensions of his investment in the value and of madness, treating it with the appropriate care and reverence, as I say in the book. And then I think the other really challenging issue, to be honest, is the NAMBLA issue.
I was going to say, because we actually have a weird similarity. I became good friends with the author Samuel Delany, who was born maybe 15 years after Alan, but was the last celebrity endorser of NAMBLA over the years. I used to publish a little of Delany's work, and that was always we'll just use that term problematic thing, which I think you deal with very, very effectively in that epilogue.
Well, do you want to talk about it, or?
We may as well. Sure.
I mean, because I think I don't I mean, it's because of Alan that we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
And it could be something that gets in the way for some readers or listeners, and that's a personal choice that people have to make. But um, I would like people to make an informed choice, and it was something that really concerned me, and and of course, as a clinical psychiatrist who understands the damaging effect of adult sexuality with children, there was no way I was not going to address it. So I did my best to try to understand what was going on there. And so let's just state what the issues are. Okay, the issues are that one, Alan in his 60s, which was like in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, early 90s, endorsed NAMBLA, North American Man Boy Love Association. He appeared in a film. He wrote an essay on their behalf, saying that they were basically um, being persecuted by the government, and they're essentially their free speech needed to be protected, and he endorsed them as an organization. Uh, I I think that was a very irresponsible thing to do. I think it's harmful to children and families. It cuts against the values and practices of child protection in society, and I really wish he hadn't done it. On the other hand, through my research, I think I came to understand a little bit more about why he did it. It doesn't excuse it, but it helps me to understand it. I think that part of Alan was really all about defending the indefensible, and I think he looked at at the persons involved in this organization as being in some ways persecuted and victims in society, and so his job was to stand up for them, like he stood up for people who were junkies or other kinds of criminals, or persons with mental illness. And so that's what he did. At another point at one point, he says to Bob Rosenthal, his personal secretary, that, this is kind of indefensible, what I'm doing here. Yeah. He had some perspective on it. And I thought of why is this guy doing this? Why is he doing something so transgressive, and so damaging to people and to his own reputation? And here's an idea that I came up with that makes sense to me. At the same time that he comes out with this NAMBLA endorsement, he has revealed that he was the one who signed consent to lobotomize his mother way back in 1947. So imagine that, and this comes back to me in some kind of odd way, because I was the person who showed him the letter that I found in his archives, and the letter is in the book. The letter that came from Pilgrim State Hospital asking him to sign for consent. And so this is back in like 1986. And so with a few years after that, Alan reveals in a footnote in the annotated Howl, which came out on the 30th anniversary of Howl, that this was the case. Alan was tortured by this decision. He felt this was the worst crime that he had ever committed. And so, in a certain kind of unfortunate and odd way, I thought maybe the NAMBLA thing is distracting attention from that which he really feels guilty about. Yeah. The lobotomy. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is Alan's own sexual practices. Do you want me to say something about that?
We're here. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think
it's tough stuff,
we
but it's
have
all
uncomfortable conversations. But
it's all part of the book and part of this guy's life. And
well, it isn't. Again, my book is not about the NAMBLA controversy. It's not about Alan's sexual practices, but Alan's Alan's experience of childhood trauma is very much a part of the book, and I see these as unfortunate manifestations of that. Again, that doesn't excuse it. People are responsible for their behavior, but it does help you to understand it, and that's what I'm trying to do here. So, in terms of his own sexual practices, Alan was in favor of consensual intergenerational affairs, as he called them. And he said that he had sex with boys who were 16, 17, and 18 years old. And as far as I know, and I did a lot of looking and talking with people on this, there is no record of him having sex with anyone younger. And he was not into children or prepubescent boys. So this is not pedophilia in that sense. There is another phenomenon of men who are interested in teenage boys, and that's what I think this is. These would be boys who were above the age of consent, as far as I could tell, at the time, and in some cases currently. Age of consent typically being 16 or 17. So I think that the issue for me is, even if this is legal, I think it's still very harmful. I myself have worked with boys and girls, or say teenage boys and girls, who had sexual encounters with adults, and even that when they were consensual, they became very problematic for them over time. And so I just see this as another way that children can get harmed, and so I'm against it, and I don't like the practice of it. Nonetheless, it appears that it was quote unquote consensual, and it appears that it was legal. Do we have the full record on this? No. Maybe other people will come forward after they hear this interview or the book, and we have to deal with it. We should want to understand the full truth of these experiences, and Alan will be judged. There's a whole dialogue out there nowadays about what happens when monsters, or what do we do with the art of men or women who are monsters. I don't think Alan was a monster, but there are many examples of great artists who made great art who are now considered monsters by some people in society, judging them by today's standards and laws. I think Alan, again, was a celebrity in a celebrity culture of artists and rock and rollers, where it was common for the stars to sleep with groupies who might have been teenagers. David Bowie slept with a 15-year-old girl, for example. So I think a question for us now is, does it change how we experience their art? And for me, it doesn't change it, or it doesn't, let's say,
invalidate
it, but it's something that I'm aware of. I can't dismiss it from my mind, but I don't know. I think that there's so much in Alan's art that is on the side of liberation and freedom from the things inner and outer that are oppressing you, that I find to be um, the right kind of supportive, encouraging message. I don't think he was an evil or mean or vindictive person. So that's how I process it. But I think it's sad that someone who wrote such remarkable poetry and that helped change society in so many ways and helped liberate people's minds in so many ways, himself didn't find peace, and in some ways may have harmed others. And I think that's sad, or it's beyond sad. It's tragic, um, um, and it's something that should be part of the conversation when we talk about Alan, like when we talk about other great artists like Picasso, for example, and his relationships with women.
And when I say it's part of the book, I don't mean that, you don't, it comes up in the epilogue, and that's where you most focus on it. But his relationship and the psychiatric understanding of homosexuality and the trauma he underwent from his mother's behavior, all those things seem to be roots of, or at least tendrils that kind of get you a fuller understanding, I guess, of, or at least more room to discuss, who he was and what that particular part of his life meant.
I think we can't forget about, of course, the things that you just mentioned, as a young man, trying to understand his own sexuality, his interest in men, and not having, let's say, proper, appropriate ways of expressing that in society. I mean, he lived for many years trying to suppress those things. He was told by his psychiatrist to try to ignore that and focus on women. So this is the environment in which he and a great many other men grew up in. So I think in some ways that contributes to a kind of, let's just say, unhealthy practice, I don't know, of sexuality. And of course his experience with his mother, and I guess here I'd rather let people read about it in the book, and not ruin it for them.
Draw too many spoiler alerts.
But I'll just suffice it to say that I've found out certain things about his mother that really, again, help you to understand who he became and the choices that he made, and who Naomi was. Naomi, like tens of thousands of others who were diagnosed with serious mental illness, essentially disappeared into the state psychiatric hospital. And yet she was a victim too, a victim before that. And there were possibly other things that could have been done to help her. And I imagine so many other people who were sent away and confined for life. So,
yeah.
Alan, that's what Alan was facing, a very, very negative, demoralizing upbringing, that he, and I guess, again, to return to the theme of my book, how does somebody take that stuff and not only, not be destroyed by it, but turn it into something so wonderful, so liberating, so dynamic, as he did in his poetry.
Yeah, it's one of the aspects of the book that I appreciated the most was that it's not simply his story. I mean, you do everything you can to bring her to life, from the limited records we have, and the stories and anecdotes of family members and such, and the poetry itself that Alan uses to I'll say, I don't even want to say reconcile, but to try to deal with her and her life and experience, that you don't make it just about him. I mean, you really do. There's a lot of sympathy for somebody who was going through what she was going through. And, it's a locked box, as you know better than I do, in terms of mental health and what's really going on in the mind of someone like that. But you don't put her in a position where it's, oh, poor Alan had to deal with this crazy mother. It was really a very touching a way of rendering her.
Well, Alan tries to treat her like a human, and not, a crazy person. And so, and he did the best he could, drawing on his life experience, drawing on his memories, and I think he did a remarkable job in Kaddish. I had an additional advantage. Because I found many of her letters that she wrote to him. I found even a kind of short story that she wrote, believe it or not, in the hospital. And I had the psychiatric records from Pilgrim State, which I got because of Alan's consent and the support of the Allen Ginsberg estate. And those records would have a lot of quotations in them, like that the doctors and nurses wrote down what Naomi actually said when on a ward at night, where she was dousing her head with water to try to put out the flames, in her brain. She felt that her head was like on fire from from some kind of electrocution. And she, greatly missed being a mother. She talked about that a lot. She even talked about the lobotomy. So if the question is it possible to know someone like Naomi Ginsberg and to see her as a full human being who had an illness? Yes, it is. And I thought that was one of the most important tasks of the book. Just as important is understanding Alan, because you couldn't understand Alan and his poetry without understanding Naomi. I found one of the quotes in one of her letters that she wrote to Alan from Building 12 in Pilgrim State Hospital in 1947 is this: "For the love of Jesus, I do not know how I got this sickness. It's up to you to find out. Your loving mother, Naomi." What a burden. What a burden she felt. What a burden he felt. And in some ways, and Alan didn't become a psychiatrist or a neuroscientist, but I think as an artist, as an advocate, he did as much as was humanly possible to try to understand, to try to respond to Naomi's question. He did it through having visions. He did it through standing up for the best minds of his generation destroyed by madness and being a witness to them. He did it through Kaddish, through teaching us a new way of mourning. How do you mourn for somebody who has what mental health professionals today would call complicated bereavement or ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss is a term, and so these are things that he took on and did remarkable work with, in my opinion.
Yeah, one of the things I found fascinating was that thread from Howl to Kaddish where, and this is way oversimplifying, but where madness is treated somewhat as liberation. And then by the time you get to Kaddish, it's much more the horror of the madness. It doesn't lead to you being a creative genius. We'll put it that way. And that's again, the mourning and grief that comes from the true admission of what she went through and what it meant for everybody in her life.
Well, that was, that was the ground that he covered. I mean, he's not someone who idealized or romanticized madness. Sure. He, like William Blake, understood that there was great suffering here. Nobody would wish it upon themselves or their loved ones. And yet, there's still value in it as a human experience. There's knowledge, there's wisdom, there's, ecstasy, there's things you can see and learn outside of society, mainstream roles that you can't learn inside. There's there's the potential for creativity and artistic witness. So this is this is what he staked out. But he started with, he didn't start with Howl, but Howl was the first biggest statement. But I think after Howl, it was said to him by Gary Snyder that there's a little bit of kind of dualism here. Like you're making all these really hard things sound a little bit too positive, and like you're not capturing all of this. And then what happens is that his mother dies, and so at the same time he is grieving his mother, and spends the better part of 6 years grieving her, thinking about how can he convey this experience. Reading, his father gives him the Kaddish, the Hebrew mourner's prayer. He uses that as a kind of base, but he includes so many other things that he absorbs from around him, including like the music of Thelonious Monk, which had a kind of rhythm that helped to gel the rhythm of this poem, Kaddish, which is very different from the more classic kind of bebop rhythm of Howl. So I think that I see those two pieces, Howl and Kaddish, as companions, and I'm so glad that we have both of them. With just one of them, it would have been incomplete.
Sure. One of the things, that struck me throughout, you address it very late, not very late. I mean, you explicitly address it when you're talking to him about some of the issues of myth making in his life versus, quote unquote, the facts, like the dates for when he consented to his mother's lobotomy, how he had it set a few years further on, and in fact, it occurred much earlier, which is also it's a horrible decision for anyone to have to make. But he was relatively young, having to make the consent for this process. But similarly, the experience of his visions and sort of retroactively embellishing them in terms of the voice of William Blake being involved, that sense of, I guess, balancing the history that you're writing with both the poetic license that Ginsberg was engaged in, and then the way that sort of self-myth making kind of perpetuates itself in people's lives, the way we transform ourselves by art sometimes and kind of elite over the facts as they were. I found interesting as a concept. I wasn't sure if that was, again, something to wrestle with in terms of, well, this is how we portrayed things, but, actually this is how things happened.
Right. Alan, like many other artists, and certainly like the other beat writers was engaged in a lot of myth making, a lot of creating legends out of your own life. And at a certain point, I guess it becomes confusing. Where does the myth end or begin, and where does the life end or begin? And I think by the time I walked into Alan's life, that was the case.
Yeah.
He didn't know, but he knew that there was an unfinished story concerning his mother and him, or unwritten story that needed to be written. That the myth making, the art, didn't fully explain. So, I want to be clear. I'm not invalidating the myth making, the art. I love those things. Those are of great value, both to the culture and to internal life as well. But I kind of wanted to I wanted to get, behind the curtain and try to understand how does one do that, how and why, and not to diminish it, not to overanalyze it, but just to get to see the mystery of poetry and resilience emerging from great hardship and trauma. And so, one of the doors into that was realizing that most of what people know about Alan's 1948 visions is based upon what he said in 1962, when he was a literary celebrity. And so at that point, he's offering us a kind of mythology that fit his new role as a leader of the counterculture and a person who is about to lead the psychedelic revolution with Tim Leary. And so, all power to Alan for doing that and getting everyone to believe it. But when I looked at what he wrote over the years, said and wrote over the years, I realized that the voice of William Blake didn't come till later, and that he had probably borrowed that from different artistic models, including one intriguing one that I talk about in the book, Fra Angelico's Annunciation, which he saw in the Prado Museum in the late 50s. But all power to him. Again, I mean, this is what we want of our artists. This is the work of art, to transform such challenging and horrific experiences into something that's beautiful and inspiring and documents human experience. We should not expect a one-to-one equivalence between the life and the art. And so, I think there's still lots of mysteries here, but I feel like the book offers a pretty close-up view of how Alan wrestled with that. And it also includes something else remarkable I'd just like to mention, which is the time that he was at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. So this is 8 months when he's 23 years old. He is being seen 3 and 4 times a week in psychodynamic psychotherapy with one of the psychiatry residents. And thank God, in those days, they wrote really good notes. They wrote it all down, what he said, what the therapist thought and said back. And so we have this remarkable record, of which I can't think of any parallel, of a creative genius at a absolutely critical time of their life, who's trying to figure out, what do I do with myself? What do I do with my art? At that point, he was, in a pretty desperate situation, and he didn't have anything published, and he didn't know. He had great ambitions, but there wasn't good evidence that he was going to deliver on those ambitions. Though everybody who
Sure.
encountered him thought he was both brilliant and also very ill. It was like, I'll put that in quotes,
Yeah.
meaning the psychiatrists and psychotherapists thought that. So what an amazing opportunity to get a look at that and to see, whether or not that version of psychotherapy helped him. And it's not the same kind of therapy that you would get today if you had those problems. But I'll just say, in a way, I think it did help him, and I think it did make a difference. Of course, so many other things that he did and people in his support system did also made a difference. But I focus on that issue because it is important to understand from the point of view of mental health and psychiatry.
Is there and I know it's a dumb question to ask, but is there anything you wish you could have asked him, knowing that, when you were working with him, you said you were nervous, you were starting out, et cetera. As the years went by, is there something that, man, I wish I just had one more question that would help us, or help you?
Yes, there may be 100 questions.
Yeah, not the NAMBLA side, but everything else.
There are no, not the NAMBLA. Okay, there may be 100 other things, but the challenge of doing this work is that we have to, and sometimes speculate. It's something we have to do in psychotherapy and in other kinds of mental health work. We have to speculate. We have to make inferences, hypotheses based upon what we think is going on in the internal life of the person. And so, I have to do that in this book in order to try to understand his experience of his mother, both his attachment to her and the ambivalence he felt towards her, to understand also the whole thing with visions and the voice. But so the issue of the voice, wherever possible, I rely upon written evidence. But there's times when I have to speculate, and I try to identify in the book when I'm doing that. So I just wish I had more chances to ask him more questions. What was it about Fra Angelico's painting which he said was the greatest painting he ever saw, really helped serve as a model for a visionary experience that helped you to understand your own experience of 10 years earlier? That's something we did talk about it, but we didn't talk enough about it. I wish I had more chance to ask him about it. But I think that at another level, it's important to say this. Your podcast deals with the intersection between books and life, art and life. I felt that Alan was welcoming me into his life and welcoming me to do this inquiry collaboratively with him. He made no attempt to control it whatsoever. But I felt bad. I felt like I was imposing on him. And maybe that was me and my internalization. But I just saw someone in so much pain when we were talking. And so I made a decision at a certain point that I was going to pull back and that I kind of had enough to figure this out. And I was going to wait until he passed until I put this book out, because I felt like it was unfair to Alan, the person, for me to intrude the way that I was intruding. It felt like an intrusion. And, now all these years later, we can share these things, and people can, I think, can appreciate the added complexity, the added layers, the added history that I'm bringing to understanding his life and poetry. And I don't think it diminishes at all. It doesn't hurt Alan or other people, I don't believe. For me, it gives me only more respect and admiration and courage for him, admiration for him, his art, and his courage, all the risks that he took to do what he did. He traveled a long ways from a person who suffered greatly to a person who was on top of the world artistically. And it was by no means guaranteed that he would have the success that he ended up having.
Sure.
So in the end, I'm still kind of awed by Ginsberg, but see him as a human who went through life's struggles, had his flaws, as we talked about with the NAMBLA stuff, but also made great art.
Yeah, it's one of the, I don't even want to say ancillary aspects of the book is that sense of contingency of him actually making it. You know, the poems themselves can be very strong, but there still needed to be, accidents to happen to basically help him achieve the success he achieved. But it raises the question for me, that, you stuck with literature in the back or poetry in the background throughout your life. I mean, my day job is pharmaceutical lobbying, and my clients all have wow, Gil's got this strange other life with this literature, podcast, and art stuff. But my question then is, do you write poetry yourself?
I have.
Yeah.
And I've tinkered with it myself, and I wrote something the other day that I shared the other day for a very good friend and colleague's memorial service, unfortunately. But I do different kinds of writing, and I think I'm most comfortable in the kind of creative nonfiction space. So, but I read everything, listen to a lot of music, take it all in. I mean, my life is a life of books and songs and film, and that's just a really important part of my life. And I believe, I do a lot of work with persons who experienced political violence or other kinds of traumas, and I've written about the whole idea of the testimony of the survivor's narrative, and I believe that there's a poetry or a narrative power in what survivors have to say. And so even in my more scientific writing, I'm trying to give a space to let people have their say, and to honor the great narrative power of persons who've gone through these tough experiences, whether it's mental illness or political violence or family trauma. I guess I'm saying in some ways it's all connected.
Yeah. I was going to ask, in your biography, it lists your two previous books, both of which are exactly what you were talking about, the political violence, ethnic cleansing, and the I'd say state-driven violence and the effect on people. And I wondered, it's almost like you're looking through Ginsberg out into the larger world with this one, whether they form a sort of through line throughout, even though this is not that level of violence. It's still on a personal level, and what it means as far as mental health goes, and what it means to try to make a better world, to make better, or to help people live better lives.
Yeah, well, I think there's continuities amongst the different projects, but this book is written more for a broader audience, and for people who know Alan and love Alan and his poetry, or for people who don't know anything and this is their first encounter with it. I tried to write for both of those audiences, but the issues of how do you endure and absorb and integrate and make meaning from hard life experiences, and how do you honor those experiences that, aren't going to go away? But how do you not be stuck in those experiences? How do you move on? How do you transform them into something beautiful, something brilliant? How do we not disparage the victims or the shut away, people who say things that don't make sense or that we don't really want to hear? How do you not do that? This is what Alan did. I mean, this is what Alan did so remarkably well in his poems that I think really shaped the culture and changed people's minds. And for me, that is so powerful. So Howl is, as Bob Rosenthal has said, a great liberating document. Put it in the hands of anybody, and never underestimate the power that it will have to impact them. So I want to keep putting Alan's poems in people's hands. I want people to be reading those. I want young doctors and psychiatrists to read them and to reflect on them, and persons who are living these experiences as well. I think it has great power and relevance and inspiration and humbleness for just being part of the human experience.
Sure. That's what I loved about the book, was that you actually have that prescriptive sense at the end. There's a lot of books that these were a whole lot of problems and don't actually offer a way forward. And I know that wasn't the goal with the book, but it was a really, to me, a very touching portion at the end to really get into what psychiatry can become, and again, what we can do for each other as people. Last question that I have, which I always hit people with, and I apologize for not prepping you for. What are you reading?
Mm-hmm. What am I reading? That's a good one. Well, I'm reading Alexander Hamon's new book, new novel. I'm reading Haruki Murakami's essays on becoming a novelist. I am looking at a lot of Kerouac and Dylan, because I'm writing an essay which merges the Kerouac, Dylan, and Ginsberg right now. And let's see. I'm excited about the new Murakami book. I'm kind of obsessed with Murakami, and I just heard that he's coming out with a new book, but in Japanese in April. So that's what I'm reading right now. But I have lots of other books piled up around my office waiting to be read.
Yeah, we've all got our to be read stacks. For me, a lot of it is driven by upcoming guests for the show, but extracurricular reading is also a joy. But that's part of the books and life thing that I talk about with the show. But Stevan, I want to thank you so much for coming on. And this book, it was revelatory in a lot of interesting ways. The sense of madness, a sense of art, and what Ginsberg was up to and what he found himself as, I think is just fascinating. So thank you so much for this book, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for having such a great space for conversation about books.
And that was Dr. Stevan M. Weine. Go check out his new book, Best Minds, How Allen Ginsberg Made Revolutionary Poetry from Madness, out now from Fordham University Press. It really is a fantastic book, and I think an important one for an awful lot of reasons. And as I meant to get across in the introduction, I am no great scholar or reader of Ginsberg's work, and Stevan really, he makes it accessible. He gets across what you need to know about the poems and what makes them great art and what made them so controversial in their time. Now, Stevan is not on social media, which, as we all know, is a good thing, but I will have a link to his profile at University of Illinois at Chicago, which has info on his publications, lectures, and the work he does for the Center for Global Health. Oh, and Stevan is Stevan, and Weine is Weine. So everything is just a little bit off. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show by telling other people about it. Let them know there's this podcast out there where this guy does interviews with really interesting writers and artists and musicians and all sorts of creative folks every single week. You can also help out the show by telling me what you like and don't like about it, who you'd like to hear me record with, what movie or TV show or book or piece of music or art exhibition or theater or whatever you think I should turn listeners on to. And you can do that by sending me a postcard. I love postcards. A letter, email, DM, or by leaving a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. That goes directly to voicemail, so you don't have to worry about getting stuck in an awkward conversation with me. And messages can be up to 3 minutes long. So if you go longer than that, it'll cut you off. Just call back and leave another message. And let me know if it would be okay to include your message in an upcoming episode of the show. You might have something interesting to say, but I would never put something in like that without the speaker's approval, or permission. So let me know. If you've got money to spare, then don't give it to me. I mean, my expenses are pretty minimal. I get paid pretty well at my day job. What you really should do is help other people or other institutions that are in need. You can find people through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Crowdfunder, Indiegogo, and all those other crowdfunding platforms. And if you're looking for somewhere to start with institutions or foundations, I give to my local food bank every month, occasionally the Poor People's Campaign. I make targeted election contributions, but I'm a lobbyist, so that's part of my job. But there are other things you can donate to, Planned Parenthood and Women's Choice Funds, Freedom Funds. There are a lot of things you can do to try to help build a better world, so I hope you will. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.